not impinging on my artistic expression.
My name is TJ, and I am free to be skating on my longboard down 20th Street here in Boulder.
Freedom is freedom, freedom from a culture, freedom from everything, freedom from, money and all the things that America really puts an emphasis on. And I think it's important to understand what real freedom is. And that's my definition of it for sure.
When you're free to live. Because God give man wisdom, knowledge, and understanding to live. To be free and live. Roam the earth from one corner to the next corner, from the north to the south, from the east to the west. Each and every one of us was given that freedom.
Come home. And now since the day that we were born.
Freedom is. Freedom is.
And I hit the road.
Freedom is expression. that makes perfect sense to me. We get to come down here and play music, and no one can stop us, and we bring ourselves to everyone else, and that's what freedom's all about for me.
Living by our own will and our own conscience instead of having people putting regulations and statutes on everything we do, only then can we truly be free.
My name is Gavin, and I am free to be free. So now get to where you're going, and I make a trail of bread.
You have nothing attached to it but love. Freedom just have love attached to it. That's all it is. Love. Freedom means love.
My name is Robert Quinn, and I am free to be who I want to be, what I want to be, when, where, and how I want to be. And I am a sovereign citizen.
Brother, a long time ago.
You gotta love Boulder, right? One of the most beautiful places on this planet. I mean, check that out. Is that gorgeous? With the Flatirons as our backdrop and the ever-changing landscape, colored with wildflowers in the spring and summer and dusted with pristine snow. Even last Thursday or Friday. Amazing place. It's also one of the most, unique cities in the world. Some people describe Boulder as the People's Republic of Boulder. Others describe it as 25 square miles surrounded by reality. In fact, a writer from the New York Times, Florence Williams, wrote this in an article. She says, "My brother-in-law, Peter, lives in Boulder, Colorado. Whenever I use the bathroom in his home, I have to heave a used bucket of used bathwater down the toilet to flush it. This provides a welcome opportunity to enhance my deltoids, and it can save approximately 7,300 gallons of fresh water per year. Peter usually bikes, but occasionally he'll drive his hybrid Honda from where it's parked next to his xeriscaped yard to the Buddhist meditation classes he teaches downtown. He is, in short, the quintessential Boulderite." Here's how the Urban Dictionary defines Boulder on their website. They say it's a crazy town consisting of primarily hippies, stoners, and a couple of rich areas, and of course, a college. Some of the things that make us unique are the Banjo Billy tour bus like this. That's awesome. If you've ever been on that. We host the Boulder 10K. About 50,000 people each year come out to run that. This year was our first Ironman. We've got one on the calendar for next year. Of course, anyone participate in the Kinetics that happens each year? These crazy floating devices. Of course, there's the annual winter polar plunge. Anybody? No? Okay. I know that many of you do this, the naked bike ride that takes place every year. In fact, I think that's Brian about third back. I'm almost certain of that. So, of course, we also have the beautiful University of Colorado. This is gorgeous. Isn't that a great picture of that? And who can forget that it's the home of Cornerstone Boulder? Here we are. Whew. And we are a congregation as unique as the city we reside in. We're made up of both Jewish and non-Jewish followers of Jesus. We respect both a Jewish and a Christian traditions, along with many more unique attributes that you'll hear about over the next several weeks as we begin this brand new series today called Living in Exile. About 4,000 years ago, God came to a 75-year-old childless pagan nomad named Abram, living in what is now modern Iraq. And he said to him, I'm going to give you descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky, and I'm going to give you a piece of real estate called the Promised Land. Being 3/4 of a century old and way past childbearing years, Abram and Sarah chuckled under their breath, and then they waited with guarded expectation for God to fulfill his promise. When 15 years had passed and there's no familial status change, Abram and Sarah become impatient. They conceive a child through one of their servants named Hagar. Ishmael is born 9 months later, but he is not what God had in mind for the child of the promise. And after changing Abram's name to Abraham, which means father of many, Sarah finally conceives and gives birth to Isaac at the ripe old age of 99 years old. Abraham is a centenarian. He's 100 years old at that time. And they're now living in the land called Canaan, which would one day become the land that God promised to Abraham. But for now, it's inhabited by the Canaanites and other pagan people groups. Isaac grows up to marry Rachel, and they conceive Jacob and Esau. Jacob's name is changed by God to Israel. He marries Leah and Rebekah. They give birth to 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. And out of jealousy, 11 of these brothers sell their youngest brother Joseph into slavery. Joseph has a really rough time of it for a while, but eventually he becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man. And when a severe famine hits the land of Canaan, the rest of the family comes to Egypt and reconciles with Joseph. And under the care of their brother Joseph and under the favor of Pharaoh, the Israelites grow in number and they prosper in the as Egyptian citizens. But a couple generations later, after Joseph's death, they become perceived as a threat to the new Pharaoh. And the Israelites are conscripted into slavery for the next 400 years. And then one day, a man named Moses comes upon a bush that's burning, but it's not being consumed. And God calls Moses to be his agent, to go and persuade Pharaoh to let my people go. And it takes quite a bit of arm wrestling with Pharaoh to persuade him, but eventually he relents, and the Jewish people are now a few million strong, and they become free people once again, but they end up in a desert, wandering around this barren land for 40 years. 50 days after leaving Egypt, Moses is given the Torah on Mount Sinai, and this will be a unique spiritual, moral, and ethical code that will guide the Jewish people once God brings them into the Promised Land. And contained within the Torah are the radical ways in which the Jewish peoples are to love God and then love each other and to love the rest of the world. And once in the Promised Land, the Jewish people are to be a light to the rest of the world and to, as they live out this radical lifestyle of faith and love. And so after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, Joshua finally leads the Jewish people into the Promised Land, and each of the 12 tribes is allotted a portion of land. They live faithfully and responsibly in the Promised Land for the next several hundred years, but eventually the Israelites begin to neglect their high calling by God, begin worshiping false idols, and abandon their radical love for others, especially for those who are marginalized and at risk in their community: widows, orphans, immigrants, prisoners, slaves. And then the Jewish prophets begin to warn the Israelites of an impending deportation from the Promised Land if things don't change. And after ignoring their desperate prophetic pleas, God raises up hostile nations to come against Israel. First the Assyrians, who deport the northern tribe into Assyria, and then the Babylonians, who deport the southern tribes into Babylonia. And ironically, these are the lands where their nomadic father Abraham wandered before God made his promise to him about the land and his descendants. And it's as if their punishment will take them back to square one. Nebuchadnezzar is king of Babylon during this time, and after ransacking and destroying the Jerusalem temple, he carries most of the elite Jews from Jerusalem to Babylon. There'll be a couple more exiles by the Babylonian over the next few years, and by the time the dust settles, there's a sizable population of Jews in Babylon. King Nebi doesn't conscript the Jews into forced labor, but they are enslaved. They're allowed to freely live and move within the Babylonian society, but they are not allowed to leave or to return back to Jerusalem, at least not yet. And these exiles are now faced with the difficult reality of trying to figure out how to be a Jew in exile. They're stuck in Babylon, but their real home is Jerusalem. Will they live in hostile rebellion against the Babylonian culture? Will they isolate themselves in clusters and stay separate as they can? Or will they completely lose themselves and assimilate into Babylonian society? And so for the next several weeks, we are going to look at what God said to the Jewish deportees about how they were to live in exile. And we're going to make some interesting connection as to how we are to live. First of all, as a congregation located here in Boulder. And secondly, as congregants, all of you living in the various cities that you live in. Because in reality, as we're told in 1 Peter 2:1, it says that we are foreigners and exiles in the world. Because our real home is not earthly, it's heavenly. We're stuck here for now, but if you don't know it by now, your final address is going to be New Jerusalem. And living in exile, we can ask ourselves the same questions. Should we live in hostility against the culture we live in? Should we isolate ourselves in clusters to stay as separate as possible? Or should we lose ourselves completely and assimilate into society? Well, the prophets and the historical biblical accounts give us lots of information about how the Israelites lived in exile, which in turn informs us how we are to live in exile as well. And I'm going to start us off this morning by painting very broad brushstrokes of that information. And as the weeks progress, Brian and I and Aaron, we will fill in more and more of the detail. Today's message is called Loving and Longing in Exile. And our text is Jeremiah 29, verses 4 through 14. And we'll start by looking at verses 4 through 7. So if you have a Bible, you can open it up. If you want to just look at it on the screen, that's fine. Here's what it says, verse 4 through 7. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Here's what he says. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters into marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. And so I call this section Loving on Babylon. The book of Jeremiah spans the time before, during, and after the Babylonian conquest, destruction of the Jerusalem temple, and the exile of many of the Jerusalem residents. Jeremiah acknowledges that Jerusalem was the home of the Jews, yet his message about the impending exile was initially rejected by most of the Jewish people. It landed him in prison, and he became tormented. Sadly, what he said came to pass, and the Jewish people find themselves captive in a foreign land. Jeremiah also had inside information from God that the Babylonian exile wasn't going to be over anytime soon, so he gives them these instructions on how they're to live in exile. Build houses, settle down, plant gardens and eat the same kind of food they eat, shop at Whole Foods, eat kale chips and couscous, marry and start families. Don't decrease increase. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city, and pray for the city that it might prosper, because if it prospers, you will prosper too. And you know that Hebrew word for peace and prosperity and prosper, and some translations say seek the welfare, is really all one and the same word. You can all probably know what that word is. What is it? It's the Hebrew word Shalom. It's the same word for all those other words. The text literally says this. This is how it reads. Seek the shalom of the city, for in its shalom you will have shalom. And if you recall from the messages that Brian and I gave over the last 2 weeks, the Hebrew word shalom means so much more than our English word peace can convey, which simply means just the absence of conflict. It means wholeness in the sense of repairing something that's broken. It means well-being in the sense of restoring something that's unhealthy. And it means rest in the sense of relieving something that's become fearful or anxious. And so what God is saying to these Jewish exiles through Jeremiah is to be his agents of compassion, healing, justice, even progress, relationally with the friends they will make, and civically in the communities that they will live. Because in reality, their wholeness, their well-being, their rest is tied into the wholeness and well-being and rest of Babylon. And notice that Jeremiah is not using language that would incite these exiles to think about Babylon as an enemy that needs to be subdued, but rather as a partner in mutual transformation. That's pretty radical. They will need each other to experience shalom. And this must have been shocking news to these exiles who were not there by choice, but rather being held captive against their own will. And yet God's instruction to them is, don't become antagonists, don't become isolationists, and don't become conformists. They were to fully invest and involve themselves in the community so that by loving on the Babylonians, everyone wins. Old Testament scholar Walter, he's not old. I kind of delayed on that, okay? He's an Old Testament scholar. He's also an old guy, too. Walter Bregeman writes about this passage, and he says this. Listen, it's a shocking decree. The slavers were commanded to pray for their captors, to seek the welfare of this foreign city, to invest in real estate and engage in commerce in a land wholly unfamiliar and hostile toward them. It's unfathomable to think about life as the enslaved cheering for the enslaver. If God commanded Israel to invest in the welfare of their captive city, it makes me wonder how much he desires for us to love, cherish, and invest in our neighborhood cities which are far from hostile. So, over the past few years, churches have been, not years, actually centuries, churches have been built largely on what's called an attractional model. In other words, we offer programs at our building and then we wait for people to come through our doors. But an attractional model is a competitive model. And so, of course, in order to survive under an attractional model, churches have to compete with each other by trying to offer a product that's bigger and better than the product the church down the street is offering. And that feeds into our already existent self-centered consumerism mentality that says it is more blessed to take than it is to give. And the problem with this attractional paradigm is that it's fundamentally incompatible with our God-given charge to be selfless and loving and generous and gracious and merciful and forgiving and, of course, a compassionate community, which is precisely why the Israelites ended up in exile in the first place. The exile is almost like God is saying to them, okay, you couldn't get it right in Jerusalem where you were free, so let's see if you can get it right in Babylon where you're captive. And so our model here at Cornerstone is more missional than it is attractional. Attractional models breed competition and one-upmanship. Missional models, listen to this, missional models breed community and partnerships. Most churches today want to be the best church in their city. Here at Cornerstone, we want to be the best church for our city. And there's a difference. There's a huge difference between those two paradigms. And this means that we not only have to leave this building, it means not leave it like permanently, but, get out of here on Sundays and not come back. It means we have to leave this building. It means that we have to demonstrate to the people in Boulder that we're not against them, we're for them, that we genuinely value and love them, and we don't think they have cooties in any way. I really do. I truly love this city. And I love the people who live in this city. And I love it when people say Boulderites are weird, because if you haven't noticed by now, I'm pretty weird, and I don't plan on changing anytime soon. And we're not very good promoters and marketers, even of the things that go well here. One of the best kept secrets about Cornerstone is that many of you tutor underprivileged students, or you work hard to get homeless back on their feet again. You work with at-risk teens. You work with housing and human services. You assist our refugee families that come here with nothing but the shirt, the clothing that they're wearing to rebuild their lives from nothing. Many of you work tirelessly and have worked tirelessly over the year to help flood victims recover. Many of you mentor and counsel those who have hurts and habits and hang-ups. You offer free medical help to those who can't afford it. You provide free tax training and services for low-income families. You bring meals to needy people. You adopt children. You become foster parents, or you provide respite for foster parents that need a break. You help stock food at the community food share. You serve meals at the homeless shelter. You care for young women who find themselves with an unplanned pregnancy. You help single women survive a difficult task of raising their kids without a spouse. You volunteer in schools. You coach youth sports. And, of course, you throw great neighborhood parties. I've heard of so many that you threw over the summer since we challenged you to do so. And then there's people like Jamie that shared here earlier, where you intentionally employ yourself or start a company where you know you're going to make the world a better place to live. And so, if I've described anybody here in any of those categories, whether it's things that you volunteer or things that you do in your work or companies that you've started, would you stand up? I'd like everybody to see just how many people are involved in things like that. Please, stand. Come on. In the balcony as well. You're not off the hook. Come on. Now listen, this is like a small percent of the larger population. And so we have a long way to go, but thank you all so much. My prayer is that in a year or two, we would all stand up and be able to say that we are involved in bringing the shalom to this city. We here at Cornerstone are all about that. We want to bring shalom to this city because Boulder's peace, when Boulder has peace, we will have peace. And I don't know how to get a win-win situation more better than that. Amen? All right, so after exhorting the exiles to dig in and seek the shalom of the city by loving on Babylon, Jeremiah goes on to say in verses 10 through 14 that they shouldn't dig in to the degree that they stop longing for Jerusalem. This is what he says, beginning in verse 10. He says, this is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you, and I will fulfill my gracious promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope in a future. Isn't it great to understand a popular misapplied passage in its context? So the next time you pray that for somebody, think more about the context that it's there, and it'll make more sense as we go on. Then, Jeremiah says, you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me, and you will find me when you seek me with all of your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. So when we get to the last message in this series, we're going to dedicate entirely to that message, entirely to this topic. So I'm going to be really brief about what I say here, but the bottom line is that the exiles were never to forget who they were, what was important in life, and where they would ultimately end up. They were to unpack their suitcases, but they weren't to put them up into the rafters. God sent them into exile because they had forgotten who they were, and they will spend the next 70 years in captivity rediscovering their true identity. Because listen to this, living in exile is one of the best places to discover who you are and what is most important in life. Isn't that what the story of the prodigal son is all about? He had the best home life possible. Yet he had to end up eating and sleeping with pigs, a Jew no less, eating and sleeping with pigs, before he would discover who he was and what was most important to him. And once that happened, he began to long to be back home again. My father's servants have so much to eat, they have leftovers. Here I am starving to death, eating pig food. I want to go back home. I long to be back home. If only I could go back home. Home is great, but unfortunately for most of us, including me, we often learn more in exile than we can ever learn at home. I wish it wasn't so. And it won't be easy for the Israelites living in captivity. The Babylonians had different values. They had different food. They had different lifestyles. They had different goals. They had different rules. They had different gods. But it is in this challenging Babylonian environment that they will learn more about what it means to be a person of faith than they ever learned while living in Jerusalem. And I know that's been true for me living here now, 20 years in Boulder. Boulder is a challenging place to live, but I have grown more here than anywhere else I have ever lived in my life. And the truth is, listen to this, we all need Boulder as much as Boulder needs us. Because while we're here seeking the shalom of this city, we are finding shalom for our own lives as well. And while we're loving on Boulder, we are never to stop longing for our true home. Psalm 137, 1 through 6, describes what that longing looked like for the Israelite exiles. Here's what it says. It says, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and we wept as we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, hey, sing us one of those songs of Zion. But how can we sing the song of the Lord while we're in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Yerushalayim my highest joy. Mount Zion is where the temple is located in Jerusalem. And so longing to be back home in Jerusalem is simply what it means to be a Zionist. That word gets a lot of negative spin these days. And it is in that sense of longing to be back home that we are all Zionists, because our final mailing address is New Jerusalem. And may our tongues cling to the roof of our mouth if we don't remember New Jerusalem and consider her our highest joy. Loving on Babylon, longing for Jerusalem. Loving on Boulder, longing for New Jerusalem. It's a tricky balance, isn't it, to walk both of those? Jesus said we're to be in the world, but not of the world. We can unpack our suitcases, but we can't get rid of them just yet. We should dig in, but not as if we'll be here forever. It's tricky. And you know, the older I get, I realize just how tricky it was when you're younger to put all that together. You know, the older you get, things begin to kind of slow down. Everything does, slows down. But it's in that slowing that you begin to look back and you say, you know, for years I bought into that system of taking and building and my own empire and my own kingdom. And I bought into that whole philosophy of just grabbing as much as you can in this life. But, you know, you realize, you know, at some point, I don't know, it's like maybe about 2 years ago, I realized I peaked. Now, some of you who are older, you'll understand this, because I realize it's never going to be, and you know, physically speaking, it's never going to be any better than it ever was before. From now on, it's going to be a decline. You know, it's like that passage, you know, outwardly we're wasting away, you know, inwardly we're being renewed day by day. I mean, so I see the outward stuff all the time. And yeah. But you know, you get to this point that you realize, wow, you know, when you're young, you don't think about the end of your life. You just don't think about it. But when you hit that summit, you start thinking about it. You go, you know, it could be any time now. I'm 62 years old, and I know you can die anytime, but you know, my dad lived to 87. That's just 20 some odd years from now. That's nothing when you're my age. And you begin to see things differently. You know, you begin to see that I wish I would have taken more time to give more and to be more involved in things and to be less building my own kingdom. And I wish I could take what you get when you're older, and you know, if there was a timeline on a screen, just to be able to drag it, that knowledge, drag it down and just drop it into you younger folks. To slow up. To stop building your kingdoms. Do you know you can't take a single thing with you? Every possession I have, my home, my cars, everything, it's not going to go with me. None of it. Not a single thing. And so you begin to ask the question, you know, unfortunately you ask this later in life. You know, when you're young, you start asking the question, what should I do with my life? When you're older, you start saying, what am I here for? What's my purpose? Why did God make me? If it's God's intent for us to be with Him forever, why didn't we just start there? Why do we have to do this thing called life where we're exiled? And when you start opening that door, you get to some of the answers. Why you're here in this city. Acts 17 says that from one man God made every nation of men, and He determined the exact times and places they should live. You are not here by an accident. You are not living in the city you live in by an accident. Seek the shalom of the city, for in seeking its shalom, you too shall have shalom. And so I want to end by reading you a poem. And I want to do it by way of a prayer. So let's just close your eyes for a second. Dim the lights. And would you just, before I read this, would you just think about what your life is about? Ask that question. Ask it of the Lord. Say, why am I here, Lord? Not what am I supposed to do, okay? There's something bigger to get to. Something deeper to get to. We've traveled this long road of life. We've seen happiness and we've seen strife. We've served God from place to place, sharing our story, saved by grace. Like exiles, we have traveled here Some days sad, some filled with cheer. But our weary souls will find their best when one day they enter Zion's rest. We must serve the Lord here below until he says it's time to go. We must go about bringing shalom until God says, come back home. Going home will be so great, but until then, we serve and wait. Still now we're longing, Yeshua come. Take us back to New Jerusalem. Father, I pray you'd help us slow down to ask the right question. What are we here for? Why did you make us? Why am I living in this city that thought I made the choice to be here, but you made that choice before the beginning of time? Teach us what it means to love and serve in radical ways, each other, the city, that both of us might experience shalom. And so over the next several weeks, God, I pray that you'd unpack that for us. In Jesus' name.